Auzubillahiminash-shaytanir-rajeem. Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. This is Dr. Muhammad Anees, Associate Professor, Department of Microbiology. This is my lecture number 9 about soil microbiology, MIC316, BS Microbiology. The topic of this lecture is role of microorganism in carbon cycle in soil. Starting with the lecture outline, the lecture will include a brief introduction to the topic. Then I'll be talking about the long-term carbon cycle, short-term carbon cycle, and what role the microorganisms play in the carbon cycle, how they play important role in the different carbon compounds decomposition. Starting with the introduction, carbon cycle, as you know, it is the transfer of carbon among atmosphere, soil, ocean, and life. There are basically two types of cycles based on the time scale. One is the long-term carbon cycle. Long-term carbon cycle means it takes over a million years, over millions of years in converting carbon from atmosphere and to soil, to oceans, and back into the atmosphere. So to complete cycle, it takes very long time. Because it involves transfer of carbon among rocks, earth surface, and oceans. Then there is short-term carbon cycle. The cycle is this carbon cycle is known as short-term because it operates over a shorter period of time. It involves transfer of carbon among atmosphere, soil, and then ocean. The major processes involved are photosynthesis and respiration. First, we start with the long-term carbon cycle. So, what was the initial source of carbon in the atmosphere? If we think about it, how carbon entered in the atmosphere. So it is thought that volcanism led to release of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and then probably the heavenly particles or heavenly particles like asteroids and comets that were bombarded into the Earth's atmosphere, and then these were degraded due to high temperature, and they converted into carbon in the form of carbon dioxide. This may be the initial source of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So this is believed that the volcanism and the heavenly particle degradation was the initial source of carbon cycle. Now, now we talk about the terrestrial rock weathering. How the terrestrial rock are, degraded. When we talk about weathering, weathering is the process of dissolving or shredding rocks. The rocks are dissolved by bicarbonates. Bicarbonates are formed by reaction of the atmospheric carbon dioxide and water in the atmosphere, which make the carbonic acid. When this carbonic acid come down to soil, they react with different rocks containing calcium, magnesium, and silicate, and this process lead to formation of bicarbonates and weathering of rocks. So as you see in this reaction, the carbon dioxide dissolved in water come down to soil and then react with some rock containing calcium, and then calcium is released along with bicarbonate. Now this calcium and carbonates are then transported in dissolved state by rivers to oceans, where they are converted to calcium carbonate and deposited. So if we briefly describe the long-term carbon cycle, it starts with consuming atmospheric carbon by making the carbonic acid. It comes down to the weathering of rocks, and then it leads to deposition of calcium carbonate in the oceans, as we discussed here. Then this carbon is after a very long period of time, this carbon may be returned back to atmosphere through volcanism, and it is again released in the atmosphere. So this is how this long-term carbon cycle completes. Here again the same, I describe it again, how long-term carbon cycle is functioning. It starts with making a carbonic acid that dissolves the rocks, and then these bicarbonates along with calcium flow into the oceans, where calcium carbonate burial takes place along with some organic material. This carbon is then returned back to atmosphere through volcanism. But this process takes place very long time. That's why this cycle is called long-term carbon cycle. Now next is short-term carbon cycle. The short-term carbon cycle dominate three processes: photosynthesis, respiration, and organic matter formation. The two important carbon gases that are present in atmosphere include carbon dioxide and methane, and the concentration of these two gases in the atmosphere is very important, and it has very important impact on the climate and climatic changes, because if the concentration of these two gases are high, they don't let infrared radiations go out of the atmosphere, because they absorb the infrared radiations produced by the Earth's surface, which lead to increased temperature of Earth. Now, these concentrations that we just talked about, the concentration of carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere, it has increased with the passage of time due to increased human activities. It has been observed that the concentration of carbon dioxide increased from 260 ppm in 1860 to around 410 ppm, mainly because of forest clearing, use of extensive fossil fuels, and the land conversions due to human interventions. So, as we discussed, the short-term carbon cycle involve basically photosynthesis and respiration. Photosynthesis fix carbon dioxide, and respiration return it back to the atmosphere. So the short-term carbon cycle operates on land as well as on in waters. When we talk about lands, there is terrestrial biota that perform the photosynthesis and produce the biomass. This biomass is added into the soil and then it is returned back to the atmosphere. Similarly, this biomass is used by a number of other organisms and that are present in the soil. So when we talk about the marine part of carbon cycle, again, it has marine photosynthesis, then marine respiration, and in addition to that, the carbonate input, as we discussed earlier in this presentation, and carbon dioxide exchange. So for marine part of short-term cycle, river transport of organic matter and carbonates also play important role, as here it's indicated. So what are the roles of microorganisms in carbon cycle? If we briefly describe, there are different types of microorganisms that play important role in the carbon cycle. First are the autotrophic microorganisms, which have contribution in grass primary production. I mean, they actually they perform photosynthesis and produce the biomass by consuming carbon dioxide. And then the microorganisms, as you know, are the principal decomposer. They finally they decompose all the organic matter and return carbon to the atmosphere, along with release of other nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus. And the total production of the ecosystem, that is known as net ecosystem production. Net ecosystem production depends on how efficiently the nutrients are being cycled, how efficiently they are released in the environment. And this release basically depends on decomposition. If decomposition is there and efficient decomposition is there because of microorganisms, there will be more production in the ecosystem. And then the microorganisms are also responsible for the decomposition of highly resistant carbon compounds. The decomposition of carbon compounds depends on the CN ratio. CN ratio defines how much carbon is for 1 unit of nitrogen. So if nitrogen is high, CN ratio will be low. So it means the concentration of nitrogen defines the preference of decomposer for particular carbon compound. These decomposers have complex scheme of enzymes that are able to hydrolyze the compounds. There are different plant compounds in the soil that include starch, cellulose, hemicellulose, lignin, and tannins. And apart from that, there are many low molecular weight carbon compounds that are labile. For example, that the carbon compounds produced by the roots in the root zone. So all these compounds are coming from the plant. Along with that, there are microorganisms which also produce a number of carbon compounds that are deposited in the soil, including peptidoglycan, melanin, and chitin. When we talk about the decomposition, for example, if we talk about the decomposition of starch, starch is composed of two glucose polymers. One is amylose and other is amylopectin. Now, microorganisms produce a number of amylases and glycosidases that can decompose the starch. Similarly, when we talk about cellulose, hemicellulose, and pectin, the microorganisms such as bacteria and fungi decompose these complex carbon compounds, and to decompose, they produce complex series of enzymes, including cellulases, hemicellulases, glucanases, and pectinases. Lignin is a second most abundant polymer after cellulose. It is relatively resistant to decomposition, and I would say it's highly resistant to decomposition. Fungi is the most efficient degrader of lignin. It can produce enzymes that can degrade lignin. And there are some soil bacteria such as actinomycetes which can also degrade lignin. Here, this is a summary of how microorganisms are degrading the different types of plant compounds, and how these microorganisms obtain either the complex plant compounds or the labile plant compounds, and then after decomposition and addition leading to formation of complex humic substances in the soil. Thank you very much.